It's all too common in this trade where we hear that someone has had an accident and has given their life for this trade. It's rare that you see someone that has taken a fall or made contact with primary voltage to live and tell about it. The person I sit down with today is a former coworker of mine and has that opportunity to share his story. 25 years ago, John Day had an accident, and he was gracious enough to sit down with me and talk about it. So I'm here with John Day. I used to work with John at the electric power board in Chattanooga. So I came to the utility in the late 80s. I don't remember the first time I met you, Johnny. I do remember one time I met you, and you probably don't remember this, as many calls and as much switching and stuff that you went on. But I was an apprentice. I think I was probably third year, maybe. We were at Riverside Substation. They were doing an apprentice test. It was a field portion, and I remember you came out and switched out a couple of bays for us. You left one of the 13 kV or 12 kV disconnects closed in the switching step for me to walk down, and you tried to set me up, in other words. So I'm going to kind of start at the end here and then work my way back. But you retired, 15 years ago, I guess? Is that right, from what I just saw?
Yeah, in 2006, whatever that figures out to be now. So, yeah.
Yeah, so you retired 15 years ago. But before we get into your career, tell me a little bit about John Day.
Well, Kenny, I've lived on Signal Mountain where I still live today practically all of my life. My wife has lived up here as well. We were high school sweethearts. Well, actually, it goes back to junior high school, where I first met my wife in junior high school. And then we were high school sweethearts. We rode the bus together off Signal Mountain going to Red Bank High School. Didn't you go to Red Bank
as
well?
I did. Yes, sir. I did.
Yeah. Didn't you graduate with my nephew, Kenny?
I did.
Yeah. I thought I was correct in remembering that and all. But, I've lived here on the mountain all my life. My wife and I married, have been since 1967. We have 3 children, all grown, of course, and all of them college graduates, and I'm proud of that I was able to get all of them through college.
What got you to the power board there in Chattanooga? I know we talked a lot. I know your dad worked there, and you had relatives work there, but tell me about your start in the business.
I've always been somewhat in the business, you might as well say, as you've already alluded to the fact that my dad worked at the power board. And Dad had an older brother, and he was also a foreman there at the power board when I first went to work at the power board. My uncle, A.G. Day, everybody referred to him as Sid Day, he got started early climbing poles. Uncle Sid, he worked all over the southeast and all when he got started in the business. I also had an Uncle Marvin Day, one of Daddy's brothers, who worked for the railroad as a lineman. My dad worked at the power board as a lineman. I had an Uncle Clyde that worked at the power board as a lineman. 2 of Uncle Sid's boys worked at the power board, and 2 of his son-in-laws worked at the power board. So it was kind of a day thing, you might say. There were several families down there at that time when I first went there, as you remember, that had relatives there and all. And it was a good thing. My first job at the power board, actually, I went there in 1965, and that was as a summer student. First day on the job, but Uncle Sid was one of those people that believed in work. He wanted to see you work. The first job that I had, we went up 58 Highway and stopped in Harrison. He had the truck driver to pull over and stopped, and he told the wagon dog, which was a guy that was up on, of course, everybody was on the line truck at that time. There was no little trucks or anything like that. Everybody was on the one truck. He had the truck driver to pull over and stop, and he had the wagon dog to throw off a pair of gators and a digging bar and a shovel. He told me, he said, "Follow me, young man." And we went over, and here was a stake that had been driven into the ground right there. He pointed at me, and he said, "You see that stake, young man?" I said, "I sure do, Uncle Sid." He said that I need an anchor hole, a bust anchor hole, dug right here. We're going to put in a bust anchor right here. Well, I knew what that was. My daddy had already showed me how to dig holes. We'd use gators around our place. I said, "Okay, Uncle Sid." He got back on the line truck, and they drove out of sight. So here I was to dig this hole. And it was summertime, and it was hot. Of course, I flew in and started digging this hole. And sometime later, I saw Uncle Sid walking back. He came walking back, and he come up to me, and he said, and I was sweating profusely. He said, "It's hot, isn't it, young man?" I said, "It sure is, Uncle Sid." He said, "You know what to do when it gets hot, don't you?" And I thought he was going to tell me to cool it a minute. And I said, "No, tell me." And he said, "Just get hot with it." I later learned he wasn't kidding. He meant it. Just get hot with it. In other words, he wanted people to, he expected a day's work or a day's pay, you know. Yeah. And so that's how I really got introduced in line work so far as working at the power board. And I enjoyed it, though, because it was always just like you. There was something going on, you know, there was something happening within the crew. It made it interesting, although it was also very physical back then, of course. You know, There wasn't any, we had, for a long time, they didn't have but one digger that would actually dig holes, and it was an FWD digger, and it had a crew of men that went out and dug holes because they didn't have diggers on the trucks. And so it continued on from there. So that's how I got interested in it, and that's how I continued my career for some 37 years. They had one ladder truck that they used in changing street light bulbs when I first went there. That's the only lift that they had, and was a ladder truck that they changed street light bulbs.
You've seen a lot of changes, Johnny, with through your career, a lot more than I have. I was telling somebody the other day that I can remember, like we just talked about, when all the troublemen, you know, they were getting bucket trucks and there was some resistance. And then I can remember having to wear harnesses for the first time.
Right.
And I remember having to wear hard hats when you weren't working a loft. Or, you know, the rule when I started was that you didn't really have to wear your hard hat if somebody wasn't working above you or you wasn't working in the air. And I know that through the years, a lot of things have changed. I just read a story that you sent me, and it talked about some of your relatives that were on a pole, and they didn't have hard hats on. Talk about that just a second.
Most linemen, the hard hats didn't come into being really long about the time that I first went there to the power board in '65. They hadn't had hard hats long. And I've got pictures like that picture I showed you, my Uncle Sid on a pole, and he's got on a John B. Stetson hat. Now, there was a reason that they wore hats like that. And as you can note in that picture right there, there was only one snake on that maze of conductors and all there where he worked, and there was mechanical jumpers where they had hooked them up. They did have on rubber gloves, but they didn't have hard hats. And the reason they wore those John B. Stetson hats is so when they bumped their head into a conductor, they would feel it hit that conductor, and they knew to drop back down a little bit because it would let them know when they had bumped their head into a hot primary. That was the lineman's hat for many, many years and all, was that John B. Stetson hat or something similar with a raised, you know, top of the hat that would go up so that they could feel their head bump into something and all, to keep them from getting fried on the pole. First hard hats didn't come into being till after the First World War. Mr. Bullard, who invented the first hard hat, was instrumental in making hard hats, but what we have today. But his first hard hat was actually pieces of canvas that he shellacked, and they had brims on them made of leather. And some of the first ones were actually used out at the Hoover Dam. When they were building the dam and all, there were men swinging on ropes, you know, that were drilling and shooting charges, and there was lots of debris falling. So that's one of the first places that hard hats were actually utilized right there. And the Bullard hard hat was, I don't know if they're still making them today or not, but they were still being used back when I was still working. And of course, they were used in coal mines as well. You know, miners, you know, would be down in these coal mines, and they couldn't use a metal hat like a first, you know, Army hats were. They wanted something, you know, that was light. And so he made some of the first hard hats, and that's how the hard hats really got started. And so it took some time to gravitate into the electrical field because of the connotation, just like we're talking about. They had metal hats that, you know, a lot of construction people wore, but they didn't want to wear a metal hat. And so we've already discussed they couldn't wear a metal hat and be safe wearing it. So that's how, you know, when they really started wearing hard hats and all that in the electrical industry. And there's been lots of changes, like you're saying, you know, as far as the safety equipment that linemen and people in the electrical field wear today. You know, the burn suits and the fire retardants and on and on and on it goes with all that kind of stuff, and the hot fire retardant shirts that started out that people just hated, you know, because they were so hot and all. And I'd have to agree with them. You know, you just couldn't hardly stand to wear some of the first fire retardant shirts and all that came out and all. I remember them vividly, how hot and all they were, and all. But
I can remember the ones, the first.
It's been a drastic change.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, it has been a drastic change, and I can remember the first ones they issued to us that we had T-shirts too, and we wore those T-shirts with those FR shirts, the first ones that they gave us, and there's like wearing a quilt with buttons on it. Is what it felt like.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Oh boy, something else.
Yeah,
they've come a long way with all that.
Oh, for sure. Yep. So speaking of changes in the career and stuff, and we're talking about being hot and stuff. In Chattanooga in June, that time of year, a lot of summer storms like here in Florida. And in June of '96, take me back to a day that in your mind, in your family's mind, will always be a memory. So talk to me a little bit about a Friday, June 14th, 1996, and how the day started and what happened.
Well, like you said, it was a Friday, June the 14th, 1996, and it was just like any other Friday. And it was, we would have that time of year, of course, like still happens today. These little pop-up thunderstorms, they would roll through. That day, I remember it very well. I had just returned to the barn. I was going to be getting off at 3 o'clock. It was my shift from 7 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. And we had a split shift that would kind of take up the slack. Guys would come in at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, work from 2 to 10. This was the afternoon, and I had returned to work. I had gone into what we call our ready room, which our blockers were in there, and we would come in at the end of the shift and fill out our time sheets and this, that, and the other, and do those kinds of things. And I heard the dispatcher over the intercom. He knew that I had just arrived, and he called out there and wanted to see me. And I went, made a few steps into the dispatch office, and they asked me if I would mind getting stuck for a little while. And I had already overheard some of the conversation over the radio. They had dispatched a troubleshooter, a friend of mine, Gary, to Signal Mountain. Like I've already alluded, I knew about Signal Mountain. I was raised on Signal Mountain. I knew part of the story. I knew wherever set of tie switches and how the feeds were and on the mountain, the substations. At that time, we had 3 substations on Signal Mountain. That afternoon, there had been a little storm that had hit the mountain. And as far as anybody knows, and they were good at tracking this kind of stuff, there was one lightning strike. We had one stroke of lightning. It struck 201 feeder out of Fairmont. It struck the middle phase conductor, and that conductor hit the ground, and when it did, it locked out that feeder. Well, they dispatched Gary. He went to work at 2 o'clock. They dispatched him to head to the mountain, and he was already en route. So they asked me they'd gotten calls that somebody had seen the wire down, so they knew approximately where it was at. And so they asked me if I would mind getting stuck. So I said, well, sure. So I just, I could visualize, that I was going to run up there and we was going to get that substation back on, in just short order, and I would be back and be getting off. My daughter was to be wed sometime just a few days in June. After I was thinking about all those kinds of things as I headed to the mountain, and I could hear the dispatcher talking to Gary, and he had arrived on the scene, and he gave them a pole number where the trouble was. And so they asked him, to head back toward the substation, and there was a gang-operated switch just a few spans from the substations on that feeder. By that time, I was almost there, so I called the dispatcher and told him, I said, hey, I'm here at this set of switches. If you want me to go ahead and open them here. And so they said, that'll be fine, to go ahead and open them up and lock and tag them there. So that's what I did. I got out of the truck, and the switch handle, of course, was locked. Got out and unlocked the switch. The wire was dead. The feed was dead. So I opened that switch and locked it back, got back in the truck and called and told them that I had the switch open. They energized the breaker, which heated it up once the one side closest to the station. It heated that feeder up and got quite a few people on. But from that point on out the road, well, that feeder was still dead. So I continued on out to get with my friend Gary at where the wire down was. Arrived upon the scene, and Gary had given them a pole number, which was a bank pole there, 2-pot bank, and we would try to use that as a reference because when they were looking at maps and all back then, didn't have the computers and all the stuff on the boards and all like they do now. They're on the screens now, but anyhow, we would try to use a transformer pole because it was easier to locate on the schematic on the map, and he had given them this transformer pole.